Today on the workbench we're going to show you how to assemble Team Losi Racing's 8 series of buggy shocks. We have a lot of the different parts here on the workbench right now. We're going to go through, show you how to do this, give you some tips and tricks along the way, so let's get started. First and foremost in the bag is you do have two different shock body lengths. The shorter ones are for the front, the longer ones are for the rear. The same thing on your shock shafts. The shorter ones are for the front, the longer ones are for the rear. We're going to actually build a front shock, and all of the steps that I'm going to show you will work with the rears as well. So I'm only going to build one shock, so I'm going to set 3 bodies and 3 shock shafts aside. Now in the packaging, this is a lot of what, or some of what will come in the box with the shock shaft. So you have your lower spring perch, your lower shock eyelet, you have an o-ring that'll go as the bottom shock seal, a guide, your lower guide, and then you have these two guys here. These will go in the shock itself in the top, and it'll give you 2 different ways that you can build the shock. You can use either the bladder and use a bladder or a volume compensating shock, or you can use this version here, which is what's called an emulsion shock. And for what we're going to do today, I'm going to build this as an emulsion shock. So one thing of note on this piece, if you look, it kind of has a bevel to the inside edge. This part goes towards the bottom of the shock body. In addition, I'm going to just set the shock pieces aside for now. I'm going to do my work on a paper towel just to help make sure I don't contaminate the parts or anything as they go in here. Now, one tip that I'm going to give you is we have shock pistons right here, and it's kind of hard sometimes to read the numbers on the pistons themselves. Like, I'm sure you probably can't make that out. So what I do is I use a black magic marker, and I actually just color over the top of the number, and it actually makes it pop a little bit more so you can see it. So for example, these are the split 1.2, 1.3s, and versus just the standard 1.3. And we'll bring these closer to the camera so you can see actually how you can see those. Oh, and that one's smudged, but you can see them a little bit better. That just pops a little bit more. So for the front shock that we're going to do, and I'll come back and do the other pistons at a later point in time, for the front shocks on this car, you actually use the 1.3 piston. So that's this guy here. Now, when you go to build your shocks, one of the things you're going to want to do is either use some Losi green o-ring grease, or you can also let your o-rings soak for 12 to 24 hours before you install them in the lower shock body. What the oil does is it allows it to expand to the size it'll actually be over the course of its life. The green o-ring grease will also help prevent your shock shaft from tearing the o-ring as you insert it for the first time. So we've had these soaking since last evening. These are good to use. And one of the things, I don't have my manual in front of me, but I was able to go on to tlracing.com and pull up the manual. You can also find the manuals on horizonhobby.com. So as I look into here, the way I have to load things into the bottom of the shock cartridge is I'll have the o-ring, and that's this piece right here. I'll have, and that's basically the lower shock seal. I'll have the actual o-rings, the white plastic spacer here, another o-ring, the lower shock guide, and then the cap. So let's get started. First and foremost, just unscrewing the lower shock cap eyelet. What I do is I actually put the preload collar all the way to the top. That makes it easier for when I'm putting the shocks into a shock stand, at least with the fronts. With the rears, I'll leave them down quite a bit. That way it, again, will sit a little bit easier in my shock stand. Pull the shock top cap off, and we're ready to get started. So this is the lower seal that'll go on around the threads. You can use some of that, the green o-ring grease on this. It will make it go over the threads a little bit easier, but quite honestly, it's pretty simple to do on there. So next, again, grabbing my manual, we want to make sure we're doing this right. So it's o-ring, spacer, o-ring, spacer. So I'm going to grab an o-ring and just slide it down in the body. The white spacer. It did stick to my finger there, no big deal. Another o-ring. And then your lower shock guide. Now what you'll want to do is there are two different lips on this piece here. You'll want to make sure that it fits properly in the lower eyelet. I go in from this side, just it's easier to get it back out if I do it backwards. So you'll want the smaller of the two ridges will face outward. The other end, this lip here, will actually fit perfectly on the inside of your shock body. There. Now I will simply screw that all together. Don't crank this down because if you tighten this too much, you'll actually pinch your O-rings and it could cause binding or stiction as the shock shaft goes up and down through its range of motion. So I can set that aside for right now. Now I'm ready to build the shock shaft itself and put the piston on. Now one thing looking in the manual is it does call for you to spray this out with some kind of cleaner or degreaser. I've already done that. Just to make sure that during the machining process they actually spray a lubricant in here to make sure that it goes through and it completes the machining process properly. It can leave a little bit of a residue behind, which can affect how the screws and everything tighten down. You'll also want to use a little bit of Losi lock, thread locking compound. Now for this, you just put the piston right over the top and then thread the screw on the top. And while the Losi A-scale kits are all metric, this is the one screw on the car, actually one of two screws on the car, that are actually standard. So it's actually a .050 size head. Tighten that down. Now to make sure that you get this nice and tight, never use a standard pliers on a shock shaft. You'll mar it and damage it, scratch it, and it'll rip and damage your O-rings. What I use is the TLR shock pliers like these guys here. It allows me to grab the shock shaft itself, hold it tight so that I can give this an extra little twist to make sure that's tight. And now we're all good. Now on here, what I'll do is I'll take the end of the shock shaft and actually just dip it in the shock oil that I have here, just to get a nice coating on there so that when the lower threads go through the O-rings, again, we don't want to tear these O-rings before we even really get to use them. You'll feel some resistance, which is normal, and then just slide it through. At this point, if you want, you can clean off the lower threads and then run the shock through its range of motion. Next up, we need to put the lower shock eyelet on. And again, using our shock pliers, we're going to hang on to that and screw that on. If you have a caliper, it'll make things easier as well, because then you can measure your shocks to ensure they are all the same length. Losi also has a shock matching tool that makes sure that you have similar oil, similar length, and things like that on your shocks. Now at this point, I'm ready to add oil to the shocks. Now in the bag with the kit, it actually comes with 2 bottles of shock oil. One bottle is 40 weight, one bottle is 25. So we have our razor blade knife. Be very careful, always cut away from you. And we're going to put 40 weight in the front and 25 in the rear. Now before you do this the first time, you'll have to nip the tip on the edge here or on the end of the bottle just to make sure that you can utilize it. There we go, and as you saw, a little bit came out. Now this is, in addition to the shock pliers, another tool I find extremely helpful when building shocks is the Losi car stand. And the reason for that, it actually has 4 holes here that I can put my shocks in and let them sit while I build other ones, and I'll show you why in a few moments. So when I fill a shock, what I do is I fill it at a slight angle, and I'll fill it about 2/3 of the way up, so like that, and I'll stop. And the reason why I do this is I'll bring the shock shaft up a little bit and then back down, and what this does is it gets out any air bubbles that is trapped underneath the piston. I'll do that several times. From here, fill it the rest of the way until the oil is even with the top part of the shock body. Since we are building these as emulsion shocks, we want to use this seal here. And while you can try to put it on top of the shock and then screw the cap on, what I find is easier is to actually lay it into the shock body or shock cap itself and use your fingernail to get it in place. You'll need to work your way around a little bit just to make sure that it's up in there. There's a small lip inside the cap where it will sit properly. There we go. Now we can take the cap and put it on the shock body itself. Now when you're tightening the shock cap down, you may actually notice a little bit of shock oil coming out of the vented cap here. That's perfectly normal. Don't sweat that. Now we're getting to the point where we're going to bleed the shock itself, and to do that you need to put this little gold washer onto the screw and then install it into the shock cap itself. So we have that there, and much like the screw in the piston, this one is not cooperating. Much like the screw in the piston, this is a .050 SAE standard size screw, so that's what I'm using here. So I have that ready to go. Now I need to bleed the shock. To do that, I hold it at a slight angle as you see it here, and I run the shock through its range of motion just up, and I should get a little bit of shock oil to come through. Once that's all the way bottomed out, I put the screw in there. Don't go gorilla on this, just tighten it down enough to make sure that it's not going to come out. Wipe the oil off of the cap. Pull it down, and if you built it right, you'll actually notice that the shock shaft gets sucked up a little bit. So now at this point you can see that it draws the shock shaft up into the body a little bit. If you want, you can clear that out a little bit by running the shock through its range of motion. I normally do this about 10 to 15 times. And that will generally get the shock reaction. As you can see, it's still drawing up, but not nearly as much as it was before, which is kind of what we're looking for. From here, I'm ready to put on my little shock booty here that'll help protect it as I run, and that is in that package there. Put on the appropriate spring, the lower shock perch, and mount this to the chassis. So in a nutshell, that's how you go ahead and build the shocks for the Losi series of 1/8 scale buggies and trucks. It's the same thing for the rear, it's just a longer body, longer shock shaft. Go ahead, get this mounted in your car, and go have some fun.